Well, as David said just a minute ago, we have this 9 Arts of Spiritual Conversation class that we have going on. And it's been really great to learn how to just discuss our faith and bring Jesus into every conversation. And we try to learn how to be relatable for those of us who maybe not always good at conversation, to look for those common moments that all people share. And David taught this past week, and I asked him if I could use this illustration because he used it Wednesday night. And he told this story of a man who was with a group of other men, and they're all sitting around talking, and this man's wife comes up to him and just kind of starts giving him the business a little bit in front of all these other guys. The catch is that the husband and wife were speaking a foreign language to the rest of this group. So the guys in the group had no idea what the wife was saying to the husband. He knew, clearly. It was just communication between the two of them, but nobody else knew. But she finished what she had to say, and she walked away with great purpose. She walked away, and the guy was just kind of left standing there in front of this group of guys, to which, he turned around and kind of gave that look. And without knowing what words she said, everyone in the group knew what she was saying. By the look on his face and the tone that she had used, and to which one of the guys spoke up and said, "You'd better get going." Now, they didn't know the words that she said, but it was very well communicated what was happening. And there are lots of experiences that we have in our lives that transcend language. You may not speak the same language as someone else. You may not be the same age as someone else, or be in the same tax bracket, or have the same family background or ethnicity. But you have shared experience that is universal with all people. One of those might be even laughter. I think a good laugh is probably one of the most contagious things in the world. That and a yawn. I was tempted to demonstrate that, but that's not what a preacher wants to see when he gets up to preach. Stick with the laughter. That's great. But one of the things another thing that we all have that is shared experience as a human race, perhaps nothing quite like suffering binds us all together. Suffering, we might say, is the great equalizer of the human experience. Pain, trial, tribulation is what relates us to each other in many ways. It's unfortunate, but it's true. It's also one of the things that makes characters in the Bible most relatable to us. As we're going to see this morning, we'll never know what it's like to be Joseph and to be the second in command in all of Egypt. But we can probably relate to some sort of betrayal by friends or family, or feeling forgotten. We'll not know what it's like to slay a giant with a slingshot and rescue a whole nation from certain peril and destruction. It makes for a great movie and an awesome Bible story, but that's not what my past week was like. I don't know about yours. But we can probably relate to David, not because he slew Goliath, but because he suffered the consequences of his own sin and his own unfortunate decisions. We don't know what it's like to be a prophet in Israel speaking on behalf of God to a hurting nation like Jeremiah did, but we can relate to Jeremiah to know what it's like to perhaps experience depression in the dark night of the soul and feel hopeless. None of us are probably going to travel the world and plant churches like Paul did, but we can certainly relate to Paul when he says things like, "God, take away this thorn in my flesh. I don't know why you've given this to me, and I am weak." And we'll know what it's like to cry out to God for strength. I'm grateful that the Bible isn't just a collection of, happy thoughts and pithy sayings, right, that we put on coffee cups and bumper stickers. God has written His story of redemption not in some philosophical or just make-believe world of happiness. God has written His story of redemption on the timeline of humanity, not in ignorance of, but in the midst of the human condition. Now, there are, of course, questions that remain. We have doubts. We experience pain. And there's trial. But fortunately, all of that is on almost every page of the Bible, too. Just this past Thursday in my quiet time, I've been reading through the Psalms very slowly. and I came to Psalm 10. And the opening verse reads, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Anybody got that on a t-shirt or a coffee cup? Probably not. But I'm sure that there are those, even this morning in Asheville, crying out with similar prayers of desperation. We relate to suffering so deeply because, like Paul Tripp says, suffering is never abstract. It's never theoretical or impersonal. Suffering is always real and tangible and personal and specific. But fortunately, the Bible never minimizes the harsh experiences of life in our terribly broken world. And in so doing, the Bible forces us to come face to face with our temptation to deny those things and creates a humble honesty in us. Yet, what's also wonderful and gracious is that the Bible never looks down on nor condemns the sufferer. It never mocks the pain of the sufferer. It never turns a deaf ears to the cries of the sufferer and never condemns anyone for struggle. Instead, the Bible brings the sufferer, each of us, face to face with a God who understands, who cares, and invites us to come to Him as He has entered into our pain and suffering through Jesus, and who promises one day to bring an end to all suffering of every kind forever. And because of this, the Bible is both dramatically honest, but also gloriously hopeful, even in the midst of suffering. And the hope in suffering comes from the gospel, which is why this series is titled The Gospel in Suffering. Now, we could spend a dozen weeks or more looking at all of the instances of suffering in the Bible, but I thought 12 weeks on suffering heading into Thanksgiving and Christmas, probably a little heavy-handed. So we're just going to do 4 weeks, and we're going to look at suffering through the lens of 4 different characters in the Bible. So next week, we're going to look at David. Now, he suffered in many ways. I mean, he had people trying to kill him and take his life for him. I'd say that was suffering. But we're going to look specifically at how he suffered because of his own sinful choices. We often overlook that in our lives. The following week, we're going to look at the book of Lamentations, which is a book all about lament. And most believe it was written by the prophet Jeremiah, who is often referred to as the suffering prophet. And then finally, we're going to look at Paul, as I mentioned a minute ago, and we're going to see that Paul, while he suffered plenty in all sorts of different ways, he also recognized that it was actually the hand of God that brought pain into his life when he referred to his thorn in the flesh. And that's going to really challenge our understanding of the purpose of pain and suffering, and even get to the question of the problem of evil itself. But as for today, we're going to begin this series with an overview of the life of the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And specifically, if you've got your Bibles, open them up to the last chapter of Genesis. We're going to look at chapter 50, verses 15 through 21. And as you're turning there, let me just offer one caution. As we do a series on suffering, so this is kind of the opening to the series, not just today, there's a caution that I need to make just for myself as much as anyone. Because there's a temptation when you examine texts on suffering and you want to encourage someone, as I would do to you and even myself. There are two ditches on either side of what we want to do. The first temptation is to minimize suffering, right? We're going to present the Bible in such a way that says, oh, what you're going through is no big deal. Just turn to God and everything will be okay. You know, and look, I've sat in the waiting room or in the planning room at numerous funeral homes with people who are experiencing the worst moments of their lives and are planning the funeral service of a loved one who has just died. They don't want to think about that. They don't care about the color of the casket or any of those things. And they're about to move from point A to point B to point C, all in the midst of their grief, and go stand in front of people at the greeting time or the receiving line or the wake, whatever you want to call it, and start to receive people who want to just hug their necks and help them, but also realize that people don't know what to say in times of suffering. So I always prep the family as best as I can to say, look, people out there, they're not going to know what to say to you, so prep yourself that people are going to say well-intended dumb things. Okay, they're not going to mean to hurt you, but it will come across that way when they say, oh, they're in a better place, or God needed them more than you did, or even things like, this will work together for your good, or I know how you feel, right? All well-intended, let's be honest. But at the end of the day, it minimizes and ignores the pain we're actually going through, and those types of things in that setting aren't always helpful. And I just want to be careful to not do that during this series, because even though sometimes a biblical sermon can seem theoretical, I understand that in this room right now and in the coming weeks, there are real things happening in your life that this will apply to. The other ditch on the other side, so you have minimization on the other side. The other side is, I don't want to victimize anyone. Now, it is true that Joseph, as we're going to see today, was the victim of the egregious evil of other people. And that is absolutely true. And so in some ways, we are victims in suffering. But what we're going to see about Joseph is that that wasn't what ultimately identified him. It didn't become his identity as a human being. It shaped his life, certainly. And all of the scars of suffering that you've been through certainly shapes your life. But the goal, the biblical goal, isn't to minimize, but it is also to pull us out of being a victim and set our eyes on Jesus for hope. So, can we do that? That's my commitment to you, our commitment to each other, even as we talk about these things in our small groups, around the kitchen table, or whatever we do. Let's keep that in mind. Well, let me read our text for us, and we'll explore the story of Joseph. I'm just going to read 15 through 21. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, that is Jacob, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave us this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." Verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Amen. Well, we're going to explore this, but to best understand what that means, we need to understand all that has happened before this and what led up to Joseph's brothers saying, "Hey, don't get vengeance on us. Instead, spare us." And Joseph saying, "Hey, I'm not in the place of God. I'm not in the place of God. What you meant for evil, he meant for good." How did he get to a point to be able to say such things, and what happened to him? Well, Joseph's story is the last part of the book of Genesis, and it actually begins in Genesis chapter 37. And so I'm going to give us a little bit of an overview of his entire story. The verses will be on the screen. Now, Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. Jacob later renamed Israel, okay? Important in the whole biblical timeline and even today. He was also the oldest son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, who was at this point deceased. And so that meant that he was his father's favorite. Now, even if you're not all that familiar with Joseph's story, you probably know that Jacob gave Joseph a pretty important gift, the coat of many colors. Now, this was a coat, a robe that would have been very expensive and very loud, and it caused much jealousy and hatred amongst Joseph and his brothers. In fact, in verse 4 of chapter 37, it says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So, family brokenness. Before we even get to the end of the first book of the Bible, family brokenness, hatred, jealousy. Joseph was around 17 years old when all this was happening, and to go on top of that, he had two dreams. Coming out of our Daniel series, you know that dreams in the Old Testament, pretty important. And Daniel interpreted these dreams that obviously meant that he would rise to power and have influence and power over his brothers, and they would eventually bow down and serve him, which actually happens. But like a 17-year-old younger brother, guess what he did? He went and told his brothers, guess what, guys? You're all going to bow down to me and kiss my feet and check out my robe and all of these things. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot went wrong. Okay, his brothers hated him all the more. They grew more bitter at him. They craved their father's love, and they didn't get it, right? In some ways, you can understand and even sympathize with the brothers. They were becoming callous and even towards the point of being murderous. As they were tending their father's sheep and removed from their home, Jacob sent Joseph out to check on his brothers, see how they were doing, and report back. But when they saw him coming, they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what has become of his dreams." Right? Sounds like a plot of a movie. They're going to get him. But at this point, his oldest brother, Reuben, speaks up and convinced his brothers not to kill him. So instead of killing him, they sold Joseph into slavery, where he was taken all the way to Egypt. Now, his father didn't know any of this, and so to cover it up, they took his prized coat of many colors, dipped it in animal's blood, and brought it to his father, to Jacob, and said, "Joseph is dead." Now, before we move on, I need to point out that this was just the beginning of Joseph's suffering. And while the main thrust of today's message is really about suffering at the hands of others, some of Joseph's troubles were brought on because of his own arrogance. The fact that his dreams, he told his dreams to his brothers, really emphasizes that he was beginning to grow in this sense of superiority. He was becoming a cocky young man, right? This would have been accelerated by the doting of his father, the affection that he was alone getting to the expense of his brothers. It was creating an unrealistic view of himself and really creating a toxic family situation, right? Now, I'm not trying to gaslight Joseph or anything like that and saying that all that happened to him was his own fault or that his brothers were justified in their actions. But it's not as simple as Joseph was just an innocent kid. Now, sure, he couldn't control how his father felt about him. He certainly couldn't control his birth order. But listen, we need to understand that our own pride and sinful tendencies and lack of even self-awareness can sometimes contribute to broken relationships, which is like adding an accelerant to suffering. We're going to look a little bit more at that next week with David. But I need to mention that before we move on. But next, we fast forward to Genesis chapter 39. Where Joseph finds himself now as a slave in Egypt. He's been assigned to be a house slave in the house of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, where he became very successful. We're told that Joseph excelled in his role, and for the first time in Joseph's narrative, we actually see the Lord's name mentioned. So far, no mention of God, but here in Genesis 39 in verse 2, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph. And he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, so it was evident that God was at work, even in the midst of this, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had." So Joseph's life so far had been quite tragic. It was improving, but not for long. We're also told in the remainder of this chapter that Joseph was a handsome man, just like all of the men in this room are, of course, right? They found favor, and he found favor not just with Potiphar, but with Potiphar's wife. And she began to make advances towards him, but he refused. In Genesis 39:9, it says that he, referring to what Joseph said, says, "He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept anything back from me except from you." He's talking to Potiphar's wife. "Because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So Potiphar's wife had propositioned him, and he said, "No, I will lose everything I have, and I would be sinning not just against Potiphar, my master, but against God himself." And so this shows that Joseph's awareness and conviction of his life before God was coming more and more clear. So she falsely accused him, and Potiphar had him thrown in an Egyptian prison, all because Joseph decided he didn't want to sin against the Lord. And so again, Joseph's suffering at the hand of others. Yet, at this time, it wasn't his fault at all. He was suffering for doing what was exactly right. And yet, again, we're told that the Lord was with him and showed him steadfast love. So Joseph gets thrown in prison unjustly, again. And now, again, Joseph excels in all that he does. Prisons then were not like they are now, and he found favor in the sight of the warden. Chapter 39, verse 23 says, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, meaning Joseph was doing everything well, keeping responsibility. He was a Andy Dufresne type of guy, if you know that reference. But because the Lord was with him, not just because he was a good guy. And then whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So eventually, while he was in prison, excelling in his role, years into this, he met a guy who was formerly the cupbearer to Pharaoh, which is the same role that Nehemiah has later in the Bible. The cupbearer had fallen out of favor with the king and was thrown into prison. And while in prison, the cupbearer has a dream that then Joseph heard about and interpreted correctly. And in that dream, the cupbearer was going to be released. And all of this came true. And as Joseph was watching the cupbearer be released, he says to the cupbearer in verse 14 and 15 of chapter 40, hey, remember me when it is well with you, and please do me this kindness to mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. Joseph was fully aware of the injustices committed against him and was looking for every opportunity for escape. So, hey, I've helped you. Please help me when you get out, when you're back in favor with Pharaoh. But when that dream came true, and Pharaoh and the cupbearer was restored in the house of Pharaoh, in verse 23, it says, the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now, I don't know about you, but those are some of those most painful words, I think, in the whole Bible. It's one thing to be sinned against, but it's something different just to be forgotten. Joseph has been betrayed by his family. He's been slandered by his boss's wife, unjustly imprisoned, but now completely irrelevant and forgotten. That eats at the soul of a man. And in chapter 41, it's been 2 years now since the cupbearer forgot Joseph. He's been in prison this whole time, waiting for his day. But this time, Pharaoh had a troubling dream. It wasn't just the cupbearer, and this triggered something in the cupbearer's memory of Joseph. 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream. Oh yeah, there was this guy in prison. Joseph, yeah, judge, he interpreted and everything that he said is happening. You should call him. Yeah, call him. He'll come out and help you. And he does. And I'm not going to go into the details of Pharaoh's dream. We don't have time. Recommend you read that this week. But Pharaoh's dream was interpreted by Joseph that, hey, there is a great famine coming in the land of Egypt and all of your kingdom. And it's going to destroy everyone. You need to prepare now for this. Pharaoh listened, and Joseph had favor with him. So much so that Joseph rose to power in Egypt and was given second in command only to Pharaoh. He oversaw the preparation and then the relief efforts of this famine that happened. And Joseph's fortunes were finally turning. And in verse 16 of chapter 41, Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer to all of this." And he did. And so as time progressed, Joseph was leading, he was helping, he was excelling in his role. He's now probably in his late 30s. He was married, he had children, and he was carrying out this plan for relief during the famine. And you fast forward just a little bit in that scene, famine reaches all the way to the land where Jacob, Israel, and his sons and families were dwelling. And word had come to them that there was grain that had been stored up in Egypt. So they packed up their things and they went to Egypt to beg for food. And they knocked on the door of Pharaoh, and who was there to greet them? It wasn't Pharaoh, it was Joseph. Of course, when they saw him, they didn't recognize who he was. He was all grown up. He wasn't this 17-year-old boy anymore. He had lived some life. and now he was dressed in Egyptian royal robes, not the coat of many colors. And they didn't know who he was, but he knew who they were. And now he had the power to exact revenge. Now was his chance. They were begging for food from him. Not only could he have them humiliated and reject them, he could have even had them killed. And in fact, in order to determine their motive for being there, he accused them of being spies. And he made several other strategic moves, you can read about it, to see if they had changed. He set things up to see if they would do to their younger brother Benjamin what they had done to Joseph years before. But something had in fact changed. Instead of betraying them and sacrificing Benjamin, they asked for mercy. And in fact, it was Judah, who had been the ringleader in Joseph's betrayal, offered himself up to be Benjamin's replacement. Take me instead of him. And when Joseph heard this, that was when he couldn't contain himself anymore. Several times already we're told that Joseph had gone away to weep bitterly because he was overcome with emotion. But at this point in Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried and made everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it. And the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence." You can imagine the scene. The years of pent-up sorrow and grief and sadness really explode into emotion before his family, who had no idea what had become of him, presumed dead. You can imagine their shock, and yes, they were left speechless because now their betrayal was coming home to roost. 2 decades of suffering, displacement begun by their abuse, fueled by slander and injustice in the life of Joseph, and yet Joseph had a choice to make in how he was going to respond. And he chose to respond with grace and mercy. He gave them food. He was reunited with his brothers and his father, and eventually they settled the matter. And so we arrive at our passage today at the end of chapter 50, where Jacob, the patriarch, Israel, died. And his brothers are now afraid that Joseph, now that his father's out of the way, are going to exact the revenge on them that they know that they deserve. But Joseph proved true, that the grace that he showed to them when they knocked on his door in Egypt was the grace that remains even after his father had passed. And Joseph said to them again, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. The end. Or is it? Well, I said at the beginning, none of us are going to experience betrayal, slander, enslavement the way that Joseph did, right? I don't think that's your story. That's not my story. But this story has everything to do with how we turn to and trust in God in the midst of how those tragedies take shape and form in our lives, in our present suffering or in future suffering. Because it's in times like those where we're tempted to wonder, where's God? Where is God in all of this? It's one of the key questions that people have wrestled with for ages when it comes to suffering. It's certainly one of the key themes in Joseph's story. But even though that there are times when God seems hidden, it's also the greater theme of this story that though God seems hidden, he was never out of control. In fact, God was always in complete control. And Joseph realizes that at the very end. Now, does that somehow justify the actions of Joseph's brothers? Certainly not. By no means, as Paul would say. What they did was completely wrong. No one forced them to do it, even though God used it for good. Certainly, God was not responsible for it. But according to the Bible, and this is the great tension, that God is sovereign and in control, And at the same time, human beings are always responsible for our choices. That's the theology of the story, so to speak, but what of the application? How do we trust in God in the midst of suffering that is ultimately out of our control? How do we trust the hidden God? Well, I think this is where the narration of this story outlines one of the big principles. If you were to read the story unbroken, start to finish, you might notice that the more Joseph suffered, the more God is revealed in the passage, in the story. It's not that God was absent when he was thrown in the pit into slavery, but there was no mention of the Lord being with him then. But Joseph was a cocky young kid. He had heard of God for sure. He probably prayed, and he knew that God's work through his family heritage was to give them a great land, dating all the way back to Abraham and Isaac and now his father Jacob. But suffering certainly has a way of humbling us and making us more dependent on and more aware of God's presence and promise. And you see that as the story unfolds. I wonder if you found that true in your life. The more Joseph suffered, the more we are told that God was with him. You're going through the motions of life with God, casually approaching the Lord in prayer and occasional Bible reading and being at church with God's people. We pay casual attention to our relationship with him, and then bam, trouble happens. Big scale, small scale, something that tests our faith, and we have a choice, just like Joseph did, to either shake our fists at God and run away, or open our hands, bow our knees, and draw near, even though we can't see the big picture. Just like Joseph, he didn't see the big picture till the end of everything. When he was that arrogant young kid, he probably thought himself at that moment, yeah, I am in the place of God. Look how great I am. But in the end, when he might have been justified in his vengeance, something has changed in him, and he asks, am I now in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring about that many people should be saved. Joseph eventually got to see what his suffering was all about. He saw the greater purpose of his pain. Now, how many of us have been through terrible trials and suffering, and in the moment, yes, God seems absent or certainly quiet. And maybe you've never related more to Joseph when he says, I feel forgotten. But not by the cupbearer or even by your friends or family, but maybe you feel forgotten by God. But slowly, over time, through trial and tribulation, overcoming doubts, facing your doubts and fears, you begin to see God's purpose in your pain. Now, it probably wasn't to preserve a nation, save people from famine. Maybe it was just to save you or somebody you love. Because suffering has a way of exposing our sin, our pride, our anger, our jealousy like nothing else does. When the clamps are turned down, we see what is inside of us that needs to be removed. And yet suffering can often bring humility in the place of pride. It can bring joy in the place of anger and contentment in the place of jealousy. And God can certainly use a humble, joy-filled, content follower of Jesus, even though they have the scars to tell the story in order to minister to others. Many of you could probably tell stories of people who have spoken into your life and cared for you in the time of suffering that you've been going through, and they have spoken out of their own grief that has helped you, or maybe you've been able to do that for someone else. God can use the person who knows how to pray and keep on praying, even though it seems that God isn't giving us what we're asking for. How to encourage someone else to keep going when things are hard. Because the sufferer knows that God may not give us everything that we ask for, but He will always give us what we need. The sufferer knows that we must never assume enough that we know more than God does in a way that causes us to be bitter at what He has allowed into our lives. The sufferer is humbled to know that our lives are never destroyed beyond His repair, and His purposes for us are never ruined. And we must say, like Joseph, are we in the place of God? Or as Tim Keller wisely has said, and I know I've quoted this before, but it bears repeating, God gives us what we would have asked for if only we had known everything that He knows. because we never know what God will accomplish through our suffering, which means we shouldn't interpret our circumstances in the moment, either the joyful ones that God is more with me now, or the horrible ones that God is away from me now. God is with you no matter what. That was true in Joseph's life, and that is true of you and me. You see, Joseph came to realize and recognize that he was not in the place of God. Justice, vengeance, was not his to levy and to exact. He did not minimize what his brothers did. He didn't say, don't worry about it. No big deal. He didn't glorify the power that he had over them either. He humbly recognized his position in God's grand narrative. And may God give us such a vision for our lives in his larger story. Now, it is true that Joseph was fortunate enough to see how his story was connected to God's big picture, right? Because we can't always see that, especially not in the beginning or in the middle. But all of our stories of suffering must be viewed through this lens, particularly through the lens of the gospel. Joseph's story comes, as I said, at the end of the book of Genesis. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about worship, and we talked about what it must have been like at the beginning of the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden. You remember that? But just as glorious as Genesis begins in paradise, it quickly becomes the unfolding story of human brokenness, of suffering. But in the midst of sin and suffering, where we see the first murderer, the first case of adultery, the first death of a child, we also see God's promises start to come forward for his people and begin to preserve and save his people over and over again in the face of sin and suffering. Where Genesis began with Adam and Eve believing themselves in the place of God, Genesis ends with Joseph saying, I am not in the place of God. And Joseph's story of suffering makes more sense as we look at the entire biblical narrative in light of God's promises, because suffering gains meaning when we view it in light of God's promises. But the flip side is true as well. Suffering is truly meaningless if there is no God, and God didn't promise us anything, or he is unable to keep his promises. But thankfully, as I mentioned, Genesis is bookended by hope. And Joseph's story connects all of his life to God's story of redemption in the face of great evil and suffering, and ultimately points us to Jesus. Some people have theorized and guessed that really Joseph's story is just a string of coincidences, happy accidents that led to the preservation of Jacob and Israel. But you know, if you were to go through this week and make notes of all the potential coincidences and accidents, what are the chances that you would lose count of all of them? Unless every one of those events happened just as they did, even the bad and terrible things, Joseph would have never been sent to Egypt. And how would it have gone if Joseph wasn't there to interpret the dream and warn Pharaoh of the famine? Enormous amounts of people would have died. His own family would have died, and spiritually speaking, biblically speaking, there would be no people of God. God had promised to make a great nation out of Jacob, Israel. So it was through Joseph's suffering that God brought salvation to his people, through their circumstances, not just for them in the moment, but for the future. Because if no Joseph, no Israel. No Israel, no kingdom. No kingdom, no David. No David, no lineage. No lineage, no Messiah. No Messiah, no Jesus. No Jesus. No us here this morning. No hope of heaven. Joseph's suffering was not arbitrary or coincidental or happy accident. It was God's plan to use what was meant for evil to bring good. In fact, the greatest good. And it's Jesus' story that is the ultimate fulfillment of God's salvation through suffering, just like we sang earlier. So when you are ridiculed, remember that Joseph was ridiculed by others, and so was Jesus, yet both were preserved by God. And when you are slandered, remember that Joseph was accused by others, and Jesus also was falsely accused, yet both were vindicated by God. And when you are fighting to see the presence of God in your suffering, remember that Joseph was betrayed, abandoned, and forgotten, and so was Jesus. Yes, both were remembered, preserved, and ultimately loved by God. and so are you. Through suffering and the promises of God, Joseph was able to preserve his people. And through the suffering that Jesus experienced on the cross, through the promises of God, Jesus was able to save the world and save you. God was able to take what Joseph's brothers meant for evil and use it for good. And when Jesus was laying in that tomb, God was able to take what the devil meant for the greatest evil and turn it into the greatest good the world has ever known. So I don't know every detail of your suffering at the hands of others. That is unique to you. But God knows. And I can't make sense for you of every event of the past and tie it in perfect detail to God's grand narrative and see the big picture and how it all fits together. Maybe you've seen some of that, but you can't predict the future of those things. We'll never be able to trace every moment of your life and every decision by you and others that has led you here to this moment today and is shaping your future. But what I can know beyond a shadow of a doubt is that because of the cross of Christ and the tomb that is still empty, is that God is weaving all of our stories together, even in the midst of suffering, to tell His story based on His promise and His faithfulness. John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, in conclusion, wrote this to his grieving sister. When you cannot see your way, be satisfied that He is your leader. When your spirit is overwhelmed within you, He knows your path. He will not leave you to sink. He has appointed seasons of refreshment, and you shall find that He does not forget you. Above all, keep close to the throne of grace, and listen to this. If we seem to get no good by attempting to draw near to Him, we may be sure that we shall get none by keeping away from Him. So whatever aspect of suffering you're bringing with you today, continue to cry out to the Lord, to see His hand, His loving kindness and faithfulness to you, and look to the cross where He demonstrated it perfectly, and continue to trust in His promises. Because when you can't see His hand, you can trust His heart. Let's pray. As the worship team comes, they're going to lead us in a concluding song that we're familiar with about God's faithfulness. But it's probably true that throughout this narration of Joseph's story, maybe you're connecting some of the dots in your own life. Maybe some of the questions that we've raised this morning, you still need answers to. And just because you hear a sermon on this kind of thing and read a story and you can feel encouraged, it doesn't change the reality of the home you're headed to or the job you're headed to tomorrow or the reality of what's ahead. So we come to our faithful God and cry out to Him and ask for help. God, would you help us to see your hand of faithfulness in our lives? Would you help us to turn to Christ and bring our pain and suffering? For it's at the cross that we know that you entered into this world, the brokenness that we see all around us. We see it on a national and global scale with war and natural disasters, the loss of life that seems so pointless, helpless. But we also feel it very acutely in our own physical pain and suffering, broken relationships, even like Joseph had. So Lord, would you draw our eyes and our hearts to the cross, where we see that you understand and that you have provided a way. And may we be given eyes to see your faithfulness in our lives, just as Joseph saw at the end. Give us the vision of what you're doing so that we may trust as the journey continues. In Jesus' name, amen.